Hello students, Mr. Kaiser here. Welcome to my first edition of a flipped classroom video for this year. Now we left our discussion on Friday talking about the timeline of events leading up to the Protestant Reformation in Martin Luther's life and kind of the key differences between Catholicism and Protestantism shown on this slide here. We will be continuing our discussion with the Protestant Reformation, only we'll be looking at how the Protestant Reformation affected different parts of Europe and kind of the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation. So for this video, have out your Cornell notes on the Renaissance, your blue packet, and you can flip to the very last page, starting with John Calvin. We'll be going over these three boxes here, the Counter-Reformation and the English Reformation. So who was John Calvin? Calvin was a French lawyer, and he helps to organize Protestantism in churches in Switzerland at the time. He's kind of what Martin Luther is to Germany, John Calvin is to the area of Switzerland. And Calvin's ideas are similar to Luther's, but they are stricter, and we'll get into that in a second. Now, the followers of Calvin's belief, what becomes known as Calvinism, two fundamental aspects of his followers are hard work and prayer. So when looking at kind of key differences between Lutheranism, the ideas of Martin Luther, and Calvinism, what becomes the religion of John Calvin, Calvinists believe in what's called predestination, where God alone determines the fate of every single man, woman, and child, right? Every single person. So this idea of this absolute sovereignty of God, and kind of all powerful and all knowing. Now again, the Bible is the sole source of truth, right? Just like it, as we talked about with Luther, and people read and interpret the Bible kind of for themselves. So in England, right, Calvin's ideas spread to England, and we have the birth of what we know as Puritanism and Puritans, which we'll talk about in our next unit. So with the onset of the Protestant Reformation, right, in Germany and in England and parts of Switzerland, right, all over Europe, the Catholic Church launches what's called the Counter-Reformation, or as we know it, the Catholic Reformation. So the Catholic Reformation needs to be launched in order to kind of prevent the Catholic Church from its destruction. So the spread of Protestantism threatens the Catholic Church, right? So they have to make this change in order to prevent their demise. What they do is they launch this council called the Council of Trent, and the Pope of the Catholic Church convenes with bishops and archbishops and cardinals to kind of talk about ideas of Catholicism and what they want to change about the church. So the Council of Trent, included in the Counter-Reformation, Pope Paul III initiates this council to address corruption, right? The sale of indulgences, as we talked about in class, and kind of these financial abuses that a lot of popes before Paul III and archbishops and bishops have taken. So what comes of the Council of Trent is one of the important things. The Catholic Church ends its sale of indulgences, right? The thing that Luther had kind of his main issue with, right, in his writing. So they end the sale of indulgences, but they still uphold the belief, right, that salvation or this forgiveness of sins is achieved through both faith in one true God and works. Right? Now the works you do, charity, donation, pilgrimage, and prayer, they still believe that both of those things combined will bring salvation for the individual person. The seven sacraments are also upheld, right? We talked about class baptism and communion. Catholics still believe to this day in the seven sacraments, right? And this stems from the ideas discussed at the Council of Trent. So what happens in England, right, what we call the English Reformation. Now, the King of England, Henry VIII, is married to Catherine. And Henry and Catherine have 6 children. And their daughter Mary is kind of the only one who survives adolescence. Now, Catherine's nephew, Charles V, is a powerful leader, or the emperor in Spain, right? And he does not want her to kind of lose power in England or to her throne, because they will heavily kind of influence each other. So Henry VIII wants to divorce Mary and marry Anne, and he asks the Pope at the time to annul his marriage with Catherine. And holy matrimony, as we mentioned before, is one of the 7 sacraments, and the Pope refuses. So what does Henry VIII do? He marries Anne anyway, right? And he kind of leaves the Catholic Church, much like Luther eventually comes to be excommunicated and is kicked out of the Catholic Church. Henry leaves on his own terms. And Henry goes on to form the Church of England, a Protestant church, right? A different sect of Christianity and of Protestantism, right? And he will marry actually 6 more times until he has a son, right? So he can pass on his kingdom, or the King of England, to his son. So what happens is Henry VIII strengthens the church in England with his son Edward VI, but Edward dies at an early age, and his half-sister Mary wants to kind of restore Catholicism to England. And she actually kills and burns hundreds of Protestants kind of at the stake, and she becomes known as Bloody Mary for these acts of violence and these murders. So as I mentioned before, these groups, kind of fearful of persecution, they leave England. And where do they go? To the New World, or to America, right? We call these Puritans. So eventually Mary dies, and her half-sister Elizabeth takes over, and she's a lot more tolerant and does not persecute Protestants or Catholics. So kind of at the end of the Reformation, right, both with the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and also in England, this is kind of the breakdown of religion that we see. We have Christianity broken down as to Roman Catholic and Protestant, right, with Lutheranism and Calvinism, which we talked about. Right, Calvinists actually break apart to be, in Germany, the Huguenots, and the Church of England, right, with Henry VIII splits, and we have the birth of what's known as Anglicanism, and then eventually the Puritans. And so by the end of the Renaissance and of the Reformation, there's these conflicts in religion, right, and they kind of dominate Europe's power struggle. So this is an interesting map here, depicting kind of the 4 or 5 major religions in Europe, right? Purple being Calvin, pink Luther, kind of that beige orange color being Catholic, and then these cities with these Huguenot centers, right? And then Anglicanism as well, right? In parts of England where Henry VIII has his kingdom, still dominated by Catholicism, right, in southern, kind of Western Europe, but we still see the onset of these minor religions. So with that, the end of our flipped classroom on the Counter-Reformation.